The Grim Truth of Cubone. My name is Professor Redwood, and I am a Pokemon researcher. I have come to you today to discuss my latest findings. Some of you may find this a bit shocking, but I will read it directly from my logs that I have taken out of my own journal. Still, though, I can understand those of you out there who may not want to believe such a story. It was last Tuesday when I headed out towards the Mandarin Islands in hopes of studying Cubone and Marowak. While much is already known about these two species, not much is known about the family life between a mother and baby. In fact, not only is not much known, but there has never been a single sighting of a mother Marowak and her child. Still, though, I went with eager anticipation and optimism. After all, how could I resist gathering such findings? I had received a tip that there was a large number of sightings of a wild Marowak on the north side. I had even been given exact coordinates. Upon arriving on the island, I immediately gathered up a week's worth of rations and set out towards the coordinates. While the journey was arduous and not quite what I had expected, I eventually did reach the location. I was slightly disappointed upon reaching it, though, as there was no visible Marowak. This means that I would have to wait and set up camp. I decided to set up camp slightly off to the left of the open field, as to stay hidden from the Pokemon. Luckily for me, as the sun set, the winds shifted direction, and I could see Pokemon arriving in the clearing. These included various Spearow, Fearow, Stantler, Nidoran, and various other evolved Pokemon with their pre-evolved younglings. Though I found it fascinating to see so many types of Pokemon grazing around the area, I was a little bit disappointed to see that Marowak was not initially there. Luckily for me, it wasn't much longer before a female Marowak made herself known. As such, the rest of the wildlife also made their way back into the brush line. The female Marowak seemed very cautious as she made her way through the clearing. Upon closer observation, it became clear why. She was pregnant, and from the look of her size, I wouldn't be surprised if I was to witness a birth tonight. She made her way over to a collection of stones and boulders, and found a small crevice between the two largest stones. After a little digging, she managed to create a small den that I had guessed would be her resting place for the night. She then poked her head out and gazed around warily. The night was creeping on the clearing quickly, and so she retired to the inner space of the makeshift den. I decided to take the time to make myself some dinner, but I did return to the spot I had found and place a telescope in order to get a closer view of the Marowak inside her den. It wasn't the best view, but it served my scientific purpose just fine and allowed me to take notes of any changes or other things that I may witness without having to get too close and possibly disturb the female Marowak, or even worse, frighten her off. As night came over the island and clearing, I fetched my night vision lens and attached it to my telescope. As I peered through, I saw the Marowak resting. Every now and then she would dig a bit from each corner, both increasing the size of the den and using the loose dirt to create a soft bed for herself. Minutes turned into hours, and I soon felt myself getting fairly tired. Before deciding to call it a night, I decided to check on the Marowak one last time. I crept my way to the telescope and peered through. The Marowak was still for a moment, and at first I thought she was sleeping, until she rolled over, and I got my first glimpse at her newborn baby. The infant Cubone was so small and was cuddled closely to its mother. I could not tell if it was a male or female, but for this recounting of events, I'll say that it was a male. I was fascinated and immediately started taking notes. I estimated the size, the weight, the color, and most of all, the one true fascinating feature. This Cubone did not have the bone skull on its head like all other Cubones I had seen and researched. So I was able to note the details of its ears, nose, and eyes quite clearly. These things I noted. I'm not going to go into too much detail though, because quite honestly, after the events that followed, they're not that important. So instead, I will note the more relevant details, so that you may grasp the true twisted and dark happenings that occurred. First off, I will mention, for a newborn infant, Cubone did not make much noise at all. Only very small growls and grunts. No familiar calls that sounded like the Cubones we are so used to hearing each day. Another thing I feel I should mention is his eyes. His eyes were blank. I don't know how else to really explain it. Even as the infant gazed at his mother, his expression was empty of all emotion. He stared at her as if staring at a tree. There was no joy, or fear, or sadness, just a long, blank stare. The Marowak, on the other hand, seemed not to be too concerned and made happy gestures and calls to her infant, hugging him closely, even smiling at him and offering to play with him a bit, in which he did not reciprocate, or even seem to have any interest in her. As I watched, I couldn't help but feel a bit of uneasiness while studying the infant. The Cubone baby did not act like any infant Pokemon I had witnessed before. Little did I know just how different this experience was going to be. About 30 minutes had passed since I had returned and started taking notes on the infant and condition of the mother Marowak. The mother had settled down and was resting peacefully. The infant Cubone was by her side, but was staring away from her. He then turned and gazed at her for a long moment, his eyes fixed on her. What happened next, I'll never forget. The infant then proceeded to clumsily climb over his mother and grab the bone that she had carried around with her. He studied it for a moment and even bit on it as if testing its density. He then slowly crept back to his mother. He gazed at her one more time and then raised the bone above his head. With one powerful hit, he landed a deadly blow right on the center of the Marowak. She rose quickly, but the infant was already preparing a second blow. I was dumbfounded by what I was witnessing. The infant Cubone had such amazing strength that the blows to the mother's head began to draw blood almost instantly. The Marowak was clearly dazed and confused, but desperately tried to pull away from her rampant child. She let out horrific cries of despair and pain, long calls that I had never heard in my life, but would never forget for the rest of my days. The baby Cubone relentlessly continued striking at the mother, always landing hits on her head. First on the front, then the back, then the sides. Nowhere was safe from his onslaught of attacks. Finally, Marowak gave one last pleading look at her baby as blood now pooled down her face and mouth. Her eyes were nearly shut, but tears ran from the bone sockets. She gazed sadly at her infant and reached out in desperation, only to be met with one final blow to the head. Blood splattered the infant and the walls of the den. The very sight left me staring in absolute disbelief and horror. I felt a twinge of rage and anger at myself for not jumping in to help the poor mother, but I quickly reminded myself that as a researcher, interfering with nature was taboo, and that I was right to not step in. After a long pause and taking time to catch his breath, the baby Cubone dropped the weapon, which now was spotted with blood. He licked his paw and took in the taste of blood that had sprinkled on his face. His eyes darkened suddenly as he quickly turned and gazed at the lifeless body, his small body shaking. He then slowly crept to her bloody and bludgeoned head. He circled it a few times, gazing at it as if trying to figure something out. He then gave a small growl and immediately started to bite behind the center of the bone faceplate. His small size and teeth chewing through the bone with shockingly small effort. Blood continued to ooze out as he worked from behind the plate near her neck to the point of the Marowak's nose. Along with breaking the bone plate, I could tell that pieces of flesh were also being digested, but the infant seemed to enjoy the taste as it continued with delight and excitement. The very sight started to turn my stomach, and I began to regret eating dinner earlier that evening, as now I feared it may come back to haunt me. As much as I wanted to, I could not pull my gaze away from the spectacle that was occurring before me. After about 15 minutes, the infant had succeeded in cutting the faceplate in half. As he heard the final crack, he started to yank and pull. I had always guessed that the bone plate of a Marowak was like a mask, but I can now say with sad certainty that the bone faceplate is part of them. As he pulled the bone from the head, pieces of skin, muscle, blood, and nerves ripped with it. Once it was completely dislodged from the remainder of the skull, It looked like someone had performed a sick, twisted open surgery on the poor Pokemon. Her brain was visible, as were teeth, tongue, veins, skin, and blood. The entire bottom half was still attached and almost seemed untouched, except a few spots where the Cubone had bit through, and so there were small chunks of skin and muscle missing. The infant gazed at the top half of the head bone plate and started licking and eating the remainder of skin, blood, and brain tissue until it was completely hollow. He then gazed at it approvingly and slowly raised it and placed it on his head. That is when it all hit me. The realization of why this happened and why there was never a photo of a mother Marowak and her infant. This was how Cubone got its top skull piece. I know there have always been tales and legends of Cubone wearing the skull of their mother, but I had always thought that it was just a fairy tale or a myth. If anything, I expected this to only occur if the mother had met a tragic end. I never expected this, and now that I witnessed it, I wished in that moment that I had never stepped foot on that island. The following morning, the infant Cubone emerged from the blood-stained den. Various other Cubones noticed him and approached him happily, waving their bone mallets. He raised his own and happily cheered with them as he ran off. He never even bothered to look back. After a long morning of taking notes and various cups of tea to calm my nerves, I decided to at least give the Marowak a proper burial. During researching rules to the wind, I filled in the hole that the Marowak had dug between the rocks, the stones now serving as a memorial tomb for the price that she paid. After I returned home and continued long studies on the biological makeup of Cubones and Marowaks, I came to an ironic realization. Upon evolving, the skull that the Cubone so horrifically takes from its mother at birth binds to it during the evolving process. The skull helmet becomes the Marowak face we see after evolution. So in a twisted way, the deplorable deed the Cubone does will happen to them as well after they evolve and have young of their own. Now I know many of you are probably asking, well, how about males? Would they meet such a horrific end? As we all know, males don't reproduce. My conclusion is, they don't meet that end. If you're born a male Cubone, you're quite lucky indeed, as you will never know the curse and sad truth of events that follow after a birth. If you are born a female, well, you all know what will happen now. This completes my entry. I know many may not believe me, but I do stand by my findings, and I assure you this is all based on documented truth. So if you ever hear long, sad cries from a Marowak at night, I urge you, please, please do not seek them out, for the sight will haunt your dreams long after you've witnessed them.